The technical side of video creation. What is a frame rate and why does it matter in your videos? Frame rates can dramatically change the feeling and smoothness of a video. Simply, frame rates are the amount of frames or images that are shown in a 1 second of a video. For instance, movies are commonly shown in 24 frames per second or FPS. We tend to see the world in a frame rate about this frequency, so it gives movies a more natural cinematic feel. Sports TV may shoot at higher frame rates to capture more of the in-between subtle movements that tend to happen in sports action. Low frame rates may be necessary in GIFs, for example, because the more frames you have in a GIF, the bigger your file size will be, because it contains more photos per second to create that sense of movement in your GIF. You'll notice that simply increasing the frames per second on a GIF will add more smoothness to your motion and transitions, but will come at the cost of a higher file size. There's even an effect in After Effects called the posterized time effect that allows you to only show certain frames, giving you this choppy animated feeling without having to change the entire video frame rate lower. There is a balance you have to find with frame rates, and it will depend not only on the style you want to have, but where your video will be placed or used. You would think having a super high frame rate of 60 frames per second would make the video super smooth and high quality. And sure, it will look very smooth, but it comes with its own added effect. More and more TVs are coming out with the option to change movies from 24 frames per second to 60 frames per second. Have you ever switched to this higher frames per second mode and noticed the movie seems, well, less real or cinematic? They almost seem to have a cheap soap opera-like quality to them. And that's exactly what this effect has been nicknamed, the soap opera effect. And using too high of a frame rate can take away a bit of the real-life cinematic realism that we often associate with movies. That's because there's too much detail, and we're seeing almost double the frames or the in-between movements of objects and people, and our brains no longer fill in the gaps, so to speak. Let's talk about the reverse situation and talk about slower frame rates. Have you ever seen a claymation or a clay animated featured movie? These are created using lower frame rates per second simply because of the hard work involved in getting photos for each frame. But notice this stylistic effect happens with lower FPS or frames per second. Sometimes that jerky feeling can add this interesting stylistic choice, and sometimes it's done on purpose to create that effect for a video. So I want to talk about the most commonly used frame rates, and there's going to be a downloadable resource that will contain all this fantastic information from this lesson. First of all, 24 FPS. This is the most commonly used one for movies and TV shows. The frame rate is the most natural for us to see and mimics our real-world frame rate we see looking around us. This is the minimum required frame rate set by the industry. 30 FPS or 29.97 FPS. This is the one we see more in TV shows and commonly used in motion action sports TV. This is also the common standard you see for online video. Think about YouTube. You'll notice the uneven number of 29.97, and that is because of a more complex issue about drop frame time codes. And I'll save that for another time. 60 frames per second. Ever seen those cool, mesmerizing YouTube videos of something happening in super slow motion? Those most likely used a higher frame per second to capture all of those little in-between frames to craft a super silky smooth animation. You will also notice most video games are usually in 60 frames per second nowadays to capture all of that motion and movement. That's why video games lose a little bit of that natural cinematic feeling in exchange for the details you need to play the game. There might be times where an animated logo might be in 60 frames per second to get that silky animation. The most commonly used frame rate for videos you see on social media, online, or where you're most likely to create and place videos will be your standard 30 FPS. Or sometimes you'll see that 29.97 as the standard because of an older issue with black and white TV, and it's since remained the standard even though it's no longer an issue for us. The default FPS value in After Effects, for example, is set to 30 frames per second, and it can easily be changed. You can also notice when you download stock footage or stock videos online, especially from free sites like pexels.com/video, you'll notice most videos come in about 24 frames per second. And remember, the higher your frame rate, the bigger your file size. That's something we need to think about when placing video on other platforms, social medias, and our own website. So let's talk about a very key word you hear all the time with video, especially motion video, and that's resolution.